Welcome to our show, folks. Today, we're diving into a fascinating chapter of World War II history. We'll be exploring Germany's rocket and missile development during the war. Our guest is an expert on this topic. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here to discuss this intriguing part of history.
Let's start at the beginning. What led to Germany's focus on these new weapons?
Well, it all started with Hitler's growing frustration with the war situation. By the early 1940s, things weren't looking good for Germany. On the Eastern Front, they had shifted from offense to defense against the Soviets. Meanwhile, in the West, British bombing raids were becoming more frequent and damaging.
That sounds like a tough spot. How did Hitler respond to this?
Hitler, in his desperation, demanded that Germany accelerate the production of new weapons. He pinned his hopes on two key weapons, the A-4 rocket and the Fi-103 cruise missile. These were later dubbed V-1 and V-2 by propaganda minister Goebbels, with V standing for vengeance.
Vengeance weapons, huh? That's quite a name. Where were these weapons being developed?
They were primarily developed at a top-secret facility called Peenemünde. This place was so secretive that it was surrounded by electric fences and wasn't even marked on maps. Can you believe that even local residents had no idea what was going on there?
Wow, that's some serious secrecy, but I'm guessing it didn't stay secret for long?
You're right about that. Despite their best efforts, the Germans couldn't keep it completely under wraps. Polish fishermen occasionally spotted mysterious objects flying over the Baltic Sea. This information, along with intelligence from various sources, eventually made its way to the British.
Ah, so the Brits got wind of it. How did they piece it all together?
It was a combination of things. Some Polish scientists who had worked on peripheral projects leaked information. There were also hints from Luxembourg. All these clues converged at MI6, the British intelligence agency in London. But there was another major leak that really blew things open.
Oh, what was that?
It's known as the Oslo Report. In November 1939, a German mathematician and physicist named Hans Ferdinand Mayer sent two letters to the British Embassy in Oslo, revealing details about German weapon development. It's considered one of the most severe intelligence leaks in German history.
That's incredible. So what did the British do with all this information?
They started paying very close attention to Peenemünde. British bombers would frequently fly over the area on their way to bomb Berlin and Stettin. At first, they didn't pay much attention to it, but soon they began instructing their bombers to observe the area more closely and take photographs whenever possible.
I bet that made the Germans nervous.
Absolutely. The engineers at Peenemünde would anxiously pray for their facility not to be targeted every time they heard bombers overhead. But the British were cautious. They didn't want to alert the German air defenses at Peenemünde because they needed time to gather accurate information.
Smart move. So what did they discover from all those photos?
Well, after careful analysis, they spotted what appeared to be a small aircraft without a cockpit or propeller, positioned on a long launch rail pointing towards the sea. This turned out to be the V-1 cruise missile. The V-2 ballistic missile was harder to identify because it didn't require a special launch platform.
Fascinating. So once they had this information, what did the British decide to do?
They presented a comprehensive intelligence report to Prime Minister Churchill. There was some debate about its validity, but ultimately Churchill decided to launch a large-scale bombing raid on Peenemünde. This became known as Operation Hydra.
Operation Hydra. That sounds intense. How did they plan for something like that?
It was quite a challenge. The British preferred night bombing guided by radio beams for safety, but Peenemünde was beyond the range of their radio guidance system. They had to plan the raid for a full moon night to ensure visibility. Churchill was concerned about the pilots' safety, knowing they'd be more vulnerable to enemy fighters in the moonlight.
I can imagine that would be risky. When did they carry out this operation?
The raid took place on August 17, 1943. Interestingly, this was right around the time the Battle of Kursk on the Eastern Front was reaching a stalemate. The British sent over 300 bombers to strike Peenemünde. They used a clever tactic, first sending light bombers to Berlin as a diversion.
Did it work?
It worked brilliantly. The Germans fell for it completely, not expecting an attack on Peenemünde, which had never been bombed before. By the time they realized the true target, it was too late. Peenemünde was engulfed in flames, and German fighters only arrived after the bombers had already left.
That must have been a major setback for the German rocket program. What happened next?
Well, the damage was extensive, but the program didn't stop. They had to disperse their research and development efforts to avoid being wiped out in a single attack again. They chose to relocate to an underground oil storage facility in the Harz Mountains near Nordhausen.
An underground facility? That sounds like something out of a spy movie.
It does, doesn't it? But it was very real. This location was virtually undetectable by Allied forces and protected from aerial bombardment by the thick mountain above. It consisted of 2 main tunnels, each several kilometers long, interconnected by 44 cross-tunnels.
That's incredible. But it must have taken a lot of work to turn that into a rocket factory, right?
You're absolutely right. The work was extensive and labor-intensive. Sadly, it was carried out by prisoners from the nearby Dora concentration camp. The conditions there were extremely harsh, and many prisoners perished due to disease outbreaks and frequent executions by the SS.
That's truly horrific. It's a dark reminder of the human cost of this war and these weapons.
Indeed it is. It's a part of this history that we can't ignore. Even brilliant scientists like Wernher von Braun, who frequently visited Nordhausen, chose to turn a blind eye to these atrocities.
It's hard to reconcile the scientific achievements with such human suffering. Speaking of the science, though, how did the relocation affect the development of these weapons?
Well, while production could be carried out underground, they still needed outdoor facilities for testing. So they established a separate test site in Poland, further away from British bombers. This meant Wernher von Braun had to travel frequently between Nordhausen, Poland, and Peenemünde.
That sounds like a logistical nightmare. Did all this shuffling around delay their progress?
Absolutely. The development of these vengeance weapons was plagued with delays, taking 10 months longer than anticipated to become operational. If not for Hitler's constant pressure, it might have been delayed even further.
So when did these weapons finally come into play?
The first V1 attack on London occurred on June 13, 1944, just 8 days after the Normandy landings had begun. The primary target for these missiles was actually Antwerp, a crucial port for Allied troops and equipment.
How effective were these V1 missiles?
They were certainly terrifying, but they had significant flaws. They were extremely noisy, earning them the nickname buzz bombs. They were also relatively slow, allowing them to be detected from a distance. Allied fighter pilots even developed techniques to disrupt the missiles mid-flight.
Interesting. And what about the V2? When did that come into play?
The V2 made its debut in September. On November 8th, Germany announced the existence of this new vengeance weapon. 2 days later, Churchill had to publicly acknowledge that Britain had been under attack from these weapons for 2 months.
That must have been a shock to the British public. How did the V2 compare to the V1?
The V2 was much more advanced. It was the world's first ballistic missile, descending vertically from the sky at incredible speeds. No fighter plane could intercept it. However, its effectiveness as a weapon was limited. Only about 3,000 V2 missiles were produced in total, and their accuracy was poor, with an error margin of around 16 kilometers.
It sounds like these weapons were more about psychological impact than military effectiveness.
You're right about that. However, everyone recognized that the V2 represented advanced technology of the future. This was particularly significant given the ongoing nuclear weapons development. The potential of combining such a delivery system with a nuclear warhead was a sobering thought for all involved.
I can imagine. How did the Allies, particularly the Soviets, respond to this new technology?
The Soviets were particularly eager to gather information about these weapons. Unfortunately, they mostly found scrap metal and debris, with no access to live specimens or technical documentation. This put them at a significant disadvantage, as their heaviest rocket artillery was no match for the V2.
So what happened as the war was coming to an end?
As the war neared its end, there was a frantic race to capture German rocket technology. The the Soviets pushed their forces to advance quickly to secure the Peenemünde facility before the Americans could seize its contents. Meanwhile, the Americans organized Operation Paperclip to recruit Nazi scientists.
It sounds like the groundwork for the space race was being laid even before the war ended.
Absolutely. Both sides were pursuing the same German experts, who were not passively waiting to be captured, but were actively trying to escape. This created a complex situation that would have far-reaching consequences for the post-war world and the development of space technology.
Wow, what an incredible story. It really shows how the seeds of future technological advancements were sown in the midst of such a devastating conflict. Thank you so much for sharing all this with us today.
It's been my pleasure. This period of history is a stark reminder of how scientific progress can be driven by conflict and the ethical questions that arise when brilliant minds work in service of destructive goals.
Indeed, it gives us a lot to think about. Thank you again for your time and expertise.